as I was saying previously, language evolution. In polytheistic cultures, natural forces were synonymous with the gods, and thus they shared the same name. So this symbol over here, the symbol, seeing right over here, refers to Ra, as in the Egyptian sun god, and the physical sun. So if the Egyptians wanted to say something like, and Ra blessed the pharaoh, and etc., they would write this symbol. If they wanted to say something along the lines of, the battle began while the sun was at the highest point in the sky, letting us know that it was noon, they would use the exact same symbol. If they were speaking, they would use the word Ra. They'd say, Ra was at the highest point in the sky, letting us know that it was 12 noon, something along those lines. There was no other writing that existed in Egypt for the word sun, which was not the name of a god. There were other parts of the sun, so for example, there was also Aten, which was the god of the sun disk, etc. But there was no, you could say, secular word for the sun. There was no word in Egyptian for the sun, the giant solar ball of flaming gas. That was not the word for a god. So this factor, and Hebrew was the same way. All languages were under polytheism. It's not just an Egyptian phenomenon. We see this in Akkadian, Sumerian, cuneiform. We see this everywhere. And the fact this exists tells us something rather interesting, which raises the question, are the so-called henotheistic quotes that are so often cited, oh, who is like you among the gods, O Lord, is that a henotheistic quote, or is it the result of a monotheistic religion trying to convey a monotheistic idea, but the language has not yet evolved to allow them to express that idea? So when they're saying, who is like you among the gods, O Lord, are they actually saying, who is like you, or what is like you among all the forces of nature, O Lord? This idea that of a God being stronger than all the natural forces that exist in the universe. Because becoming a monotheist does not make the various forces of the natural world that affect our human lives go away. That doesn't mean these people aren't thinking about this. If the sun is beating down on you and you're sweating and you're dying of thirst, the sun's going to be pretty important to you. But whether you think of the sun as a god with a sentient thought process, or whether you think of the sun as a force that's under the control of a god that also controls other natural forces, that's where we see the breakdown between monotheism and polytheism. So this raises this question: is this the result of a religion trying to express its ideas, but the language has not yet caught up with the idea yet? So while the ancient Israelites have this idea of a single God, they've made that revolutionary switch, has the language not yet caught up to the idea? So they're struggling to use a polytheistic language to express a monotheistic idea. Is that what's going on? That's what historians are actively discussing. So let's also talk a little bit about alphabetical writing. So there are two types of writing that exist in the world. Well, yeah, pretty much two types of writing that exist in the world: ideographic and alphabetic. So ideographic is a writing system in which one symbol equals one word or concept. So again, think about hieroglyphics or cuneiform. One symbol equals one word or one concept. So there's a single symbol that means the sun. There's a single symbol that means war or means chariot or means whatever. In alphabetical writing, one symbol, what we would call a letter, doesn't represent a word or a concept, it represents a sound. Now, what's important about this, so we're going to explain why it's so important. So, the earliest samples of alphabetic writing were found in Lower Egypt. And they date to around 1800 or so BCE. Now, it's vital to the spread of monotheism. Why? Well, one major issue with alphabetical writing is that it's easier to learn than ideographic languages. Why? Because there's actually a relatively limited amount of sounds that human beings can make with their mouth. That's the basic answer. Most alphabets will not have much more than, say, I think the absolute cap they've seen on an alphabet is 46 characters. That's the lowest they've seen is 18. So basically, because of that, you don't need to know a whole lot of symbols to become literate. Think about it. When you were in kindergarten and you learned the alphabet, that was it. 26 letters you learned, that's all you've ever needed in order to become literate. You'll learn other words. Ms. Riley's teaching you all different words, but she doesn't have to teach you a new symbol every time she teaches you a new word. Now imagine if every single symbol, if you have to have a new symbol for each time you had a new word. So every vocab word was a new symbol you had to learn how to draw. It would become immensely complicated, right? Immensely difficult to read because you needed to memorize just long lists of symbols in order to understand anything. So with fewer symbols, it's much easier to get a larger population reading. Ideographic writing systems tended to limit literacy to the elite. It was only the very, very wealthy, the very, very powerful, the very, very entrenched in society, your kings, your scribes, your high priests. These were the people that knew how to write cuneiform, who knew how to write and read hieroglyphics, etc. Once you get into the world of an alphabet, you suddenly have a system in which it's much easier for the average person to be able to learn how to read. And as a result of it, the alphabet allowed for the rapid diffusion of new ideas. New ideas like, hey, there's only one God, would not have been able to exist under an ideographic writing system because you would have to have reached a very high level in society in order to have the idea and write it down somewhere. And then even still, if you did, only a very narrow group of people would have been able to read it and understand it. And of those people, most of them were probably entrenched in the old way of understanding things. It's actually why this is one speculation that exists about the whole business with the Amarna period. One often cited theory is the idea that Akhenaten might have been moving in a more monotheistic direction, but one, the language hadn't yet caught up to the idea. So that's why you have references to Aten creating other gods. Even though the only thing worshipped was Aten, is this potentially an example where you don't really have, they don't have a word for for Aten made the sun, so they have to say Aten begat Ra, or Aten made Ra. Even if that's not entirely what they mean, they don't mean that there's two gods. Aten and Ra, they mean that there's a god, Aten, and then there's this thing called the sun, which is also called Ra in Egypt. He made it. Not so clear. That's a lot of the debate about the Amarna period as well. That's why the Amarna period is so interesting, because it looks like it's an aborted monotheism. It looks like Egypt was heading that way, and then they turned back under Tutankhamun. And one reason that may think why this happened is if you think about it, the only people that could still read and write hieroglyphics were the pharaohs and the royal family, you were the nobility. The rest of them, though, were the high priests and the scribes, the people who were most entrenched in the old polytheistic ways. So it's pretty hard to spread a new idea like there's only one God, when most of the people reading the idea have a vested interest in that idea dying with you. And that's ultimately what happened with the Amarna period. It didn't long outlive Akhenaten. But once you have an alphabetic idea, you can spread it much quicker over a much larger group of people. And many say that's what happened with the Torah. And that's why monotheism spread like wildfire, beginning in Israel and eventually via Judaism, and then later Christianity and Islam, spread to the rest of the world. That without the alphabetic writing systems that accompanied it, it never would have gotten as far as it did. That just wouldn't have happened. So now one last thing that has to be discussed as a possible issue with monolatry and henotheism. And it's one issue that I didn't want to make a bullet point of because I don't want to seem like I'm swaying the class one way or the other. But I think it's one thing that's kind of an issue between the revolutionary versus evolutionary theory. The problem with the evolutionary theory is one thing that Wellhausen himself never really entirely explains is if polytheistic cultures regard each god as representing a particular natural force, then how is it that you end up with monotheisms where one god controls all the natural forces? He assumes that just sort of happens, but to a certain extent it's not logically consistent. So let's go back to the example I gave before of Athena, right? So one can see easily how an Athenian might have felt that while there were many other gods that might have existed, that only Athena cared particularly for the Athenians and for Athens. That makes sense. You can also see how eventually that could develop into something where an Athenian thinks that, well, just as how Athens is better than all the other Greek city-states, that Athena is superior to all the other gods and goddesses of Greece. That didn't actually happen, but you could argue, you could see how something like that might have transpired. But if Athena is the goddess of wisdom, then how would she end up in a system? She can't really end up in a system as a sole deity, because she is seen as the personification of wisdom. So you still need the other forces. You still have war, you still have love, and even if you think that wisdom is superior to all the others, it doesn't negate the need for the others. It doesn't create a system where she's in charge of the others become non-entities, which is ultimately what happens in monotheism. In monotheism, anything else that was a god becomes a non-entity. One god. So anything else that you might have called a god is not a god. It's a natural force, or it's a spirit, or it's something, but it's not a god. And that's an issue. And I think that's one thing that Wellhausen's explanation does not explain as well as the revolutionary theory. Because in that case, if you're starting from the thing that is the unity, then it makes sense. Because now you're just differentiating the relationship. It's not that it's the creator of the gods and the gods. It's a god and the natural forces. It's just an issue of, as I explained before, the definition. That you're not explaining each natural force as a god. Rather, it's the unity behind all those natural forces that becomes a god. That's just my opinion and the opinion of some of the scholars I agree with. That concludes our lesson on the introduction to monotheism.